David was once a barefoot boy picking bottles from the trash heaps of Lagos, a child invisible to the world. His days were filled with hunger, dust, and rejection. But after a chance encounter with billionaire Richard Williams and his daughter Emily, his life changed overnight. From the streets of Mushin to the polished gates of an elite international school in Victoria Island, David was given a scholarship and placed in classrooms he had only dreamed of. Emily, the daughter of wealth, saw him as her greatest teacher and friend. Richard, the billionaire hardened by years of pride, now saw David as more than a boy. He saw him as the mirror that revealed the emptiness in his own life. Yet, new beginnings come with new struggles. In this world of privilege, whispers followed David, the trash boy. His oversized shoes, his simple lunch, his quiet nature, they made him a target. And while Emily stood by his side, determined to shield him, Richard watched anxiously, realizing that opportunity alone could not protect the boy from cruelty. The story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. Because for David, stepping into this new world meant facing a test harder than poverty, acceptance. But how does a child of the streets survive in a place where wealth decides who belongs? Would brilliance be enough to silence the voices of mockery and doubt? And what would Richard do when the very society he belonged to turned against the boy he had chosen to defend? Sit back, grab your popcorn, and let's dive into this interesting story. The gates of St. Mark's International School swung open on a cool Monday morning. Students in crisp uniforms streamed in, their polished shoes clicking against the tiled floors. Luxury SUVs lined the street, chauffeurs unloading backpacks, parents waving goodbye. Among them walked David, his steps hesitant but steady. His uniform was new, donated through the scholarship fund Richard had established, but his nervous fingers clutched the strap of his backpack tightly. Unlike the other children, his shoes were slightly oversized, his shirt collar too stiff. The school felt like another world, and for the first time in his life, David was entering it not as an outsider picking bottles at the gates, but as a student. At the entrance, Richard stood with Emily. He had insisted on bringing David himself that day. "You belong here, son," he said firmly, placing a reassuring hand on David's shoulder. But inside, Richard's heart pounded. He knew Lagos society. He knew privilege didn't easily open its arms. This was just the beginning of a new kind of test. Emily squeezed David's hand. "Don't be scared. I'll be with you," she whispered. Her smile was bright, but her eyes carried a protective sharpness. She had already decided that if anyone dared laugh at David, they would have to face her first. The corridors buzzed with whispers as David walked in. Some children stared openly. "Isn't that the boy from the news?" one girl muttered. "The trash boy," another boy snickered under his breath. David's ears burned, but he kept his eyes forward. He had heard worse before, but somehow here it cut deeper. In class, the teacher welcomed him warmly, introducing him as a brilliant mind we are privileged to have with us. David bowed his head shyly, but the murmurs around him didn't stop. When he pulled out his pencil case, simple, cheap plastic, a boy beside him laughed and pulled out his shiny imported set, whispering, "This isn't Mushin Market, you know." David's hand trembled, but he held his silence. At recess, Emily found him sitting alone under a mango tree, his untouched lunchbox on his lap. "Why aren't you eating?" she asked. David shrugged. "I'm not hungry." But his eyes betrayed him. They were glassy with unshed tears. Emily sat beside him, sharing her sandwich. "Don't mind them. They don't know who you really are." From a distance, Richard watched through his car window. He had planned to leave after dropping them off, but something inside him refused. He saw David's slumped shoulders, the way Emily tried to lift him. A pang of guilt hit him. Had he thrown this boy into a lion's den without preparing him? As the bell rang and the children rushed back into class, Richard whispered to himself, "This will not break him." It must not. The weeks passed quickly at St. Mark's International School, and David's presence became impossible to ignore. At first, many students whispered behind his back, calling him the trash boy or laughing at his simple lunchbox. But when classes began, something happened no one expected. David's hand was always the first to shoot up. In mathematics, he solved problems faster than anyone. In science, he asked questions even the teachers paused to think about. Soon, the same students who mocked him were forced to watch as he consistently topped the class. His brilliance couldn't be denied, and that was when the tension truly began. During one lesson, the teacher wrote a complicated equation on the board. Most students frowned, confused. David raised his hand quietly. With chalk in hand, he solved it step by step until the answer appeared neatly at the bottom. The teacher clapped proudly. "Class, this is an example of true intelligence. Well done, David." Some students clapped politely, but others sneered. A boy at the back, Tunde, son of a wealthy politician, muttered loudly, "So what? He's still a trash picker. My driver's boy can probably do the same." Laughter rippled through the room. David felt the sting but stayed silent. Emily turned sharply in her seat. "At least he can solve the problem." "Can you?" she shot back. The class went quiet, and Tunde's face flushed with anger. Outside the classroom, things got worse. Parents began whispering too. At the PTA meeting, some complained that Richard had brought a street child into a place meant for the elite. One mother hissed, "Our children will learn bad habits. What if he steals?" Another added, "Why humiliate us by glorifying a boy from the gutter?" News reached Richard quickly. At his office in Victoria Island, a board member leaned across the table. "Sir, with all respect, this experiment of yours is attracting the wrong kind of attention. People are saying you're trying to embarrass the rich." Richard sat silently, fingers steepled. Inside, anger burned. He had expected resistance, but hearing society spit venom at a child made his stomach twist. That evening, he drove to the school unannounced. From his car, he saw David again, this time sitting under the mango tree with Emily. David's eyes looked heavy. "I don't belong here," he said softly. "They'll never let me." Emily shook her head firmly. "Don't say that. You're smarter than all of them, David. That's why they hate you. But Daddy and I, we believe in you." Richard's chest tightened as he overheard. He had thought money was the hardest barrier David would face. But now he understood. The true enemy was prejudice. It was a humid Friday afternoon when the storm broke. The math teacher had announced a surprise quiz, and as usual, David finished first. His answers were neat, precise, and correct. The teacher held up his paper as an example to the class. But instead of admiration, murmurs filled the room. At the back, Tunde rolled his eyes. "Of course, the trash boy is first. Maybe he copied from one of the books he picked in the gutter." Laughter echoed around the classroom. David clenched his fists under the desk, heat rising in his chest. He wanted to fight back, but years of survival on the streets had taught him silence was safer. The teacher tried to calm the class, but the damage was done. By break time, the whispers had turned into outright mockery. A group of boys cornered David near the lockers. "Hey, trash boy," one sneered, blocking his way. "Solve this math problem." He scribbled random numbers on a paper, deliberately messy. David glanced at it, confused. Before he could respond, another boy snatched his lunchbox and dumped it on the floor. Rice spilled across the tiles. Emily arrived just in time to see David drop to his knees, quietly picking up the scattered grains. Her heart broke. "Stop it," she shouted, her voice ringing across the corridor. "Why are you treating him like this? He's smarter than all of you." The bullies smirked, but backed away when a teacher approached. David kept his head low, his hands trembling as he picked up the last of his food. For the first time since he entered the school, he felt crushed. That evening, he sat on the curb outside the gates, sack at his feet, waiting for Richard's car. When Emily tried to cheer him up, he shook his head. "Emily, maybe I should just go back. I don't belong here. They'll never let me." Inside the car, Richard listened in silence. Each word pierced him like a blade. He wanted to tell David he was wrong, but deep down he feared the boy was right. The next morning, the headlines exploded. One newspaper ran the story: Billionaire's scholarship boy humiliated at elite school. Richard's rivals seized the chance. At a private business meeting, a longtime competitor sneered, "You've made a fool of yourself, Richard. Elevating a trash picker? Look how it's backfiring. You're embarrassing your own name." Richard's fists clenched under the table. He had weathered many storms in business, but this was different. This was personal. It wasn't just about his reputation. It was about David's spirit and Emily's faith in him. That night, Richard walked into Emily's room. She sat by the window, arms folded, fuming. "Daddy, they hurt him. They made him cry. How can people be so cruel?" Richard swallowed hard. "Because sometimes, Emily, people fear what they don't understand. And David, he's proof that brilliance can rise from anywhere." He knew then. Silence was no longer an option. Something had to change. The backlash had grown louder. Newspapers mocked Richard's decision. Elite families whispered that he had lowered the standard of St. Mark's, and even some of his business partners urged him to quietly end the scholarship. But Richard Williams was not a man who bowed to pressure. For years he had fought in boardrooms and across industries to build his empire. Now, for the first time, the battle was not about money, but about dignity. A boy's dignity. That Monday morning, Richard called a press conference at Channel's television headquarters in Lagos. The hall was packed with reporters, cameras flashing, microphones lined on the podium. Whispers ran through the crowd. What would the billionaire say? Richard stepped up, his face calm but firm. Emily and David stood behind him. David's shoulders were tense, his new uniform slightly crumpled, but his eyes were sharp, watching everything. "Good morning, Lagos," Richard began. "In recent weeks, much has been said about my decision to support a boy named David, a boy some of you call the trash boy." His voice carried across the hall. "Yes, David once picked bottles from the streets, but what many of you fail to see is that this boy carries more brilliance, discipline, and courage than some who live in mansions." Reporters scribbled furiously. Richard's words were bold, almost defiant. "And today," Richard continued, turning slightly, "I will not speak for him. He will speak for himself." The room went silent. David's eyes widened, his heart pounding. He hadn't expected this. Emily squeezed his hand. "You can do it," she whispered. Slowly, David stepped up to the microphone. His voice trembled at first. "My name is David. Yeah, I picked bottles. I searched through trash to survive. But in that trash, I found books. I found knowledge. I found hope." He paused, scanning the room. His voice grew stronger. "I didn't choose poverty, but I chose to learn. And now all I want is a chance to prove that where you come from doesn't define who you can become." The hall was still. Cameras zoomed in. Even the reporters, hardened by years of chasing stories, were silent for a moment. David's words hit harder than anything Richard could have said. He wasn't begging for pity. He was showing strength. When he stepped back, the applause began slowly, then spread across the room. Some reporters stood, clapping harder. The story had shifted. No longer was he just the trash boy. He was David, a symbol of resilience. Richard placed a hand on his shoulder, pride swelling in his chest. "This is why I will never apologize for standing by him," he said firmly. "Because children like David remind us of a truth Lagos, and the world, must never forget. Brilliance can rise from anywhere." 2 months after the press conference, Lagos buzzed again, this time with anticipation. The National Mathematics Olympiad was taking place at the University of Lagos, and the brightest students from across the country had gathered. For many, it was a stage to prove intelligence. For David, it was more than that. It was a chance to silence the whispers that still clung to him like shadows. The auditorium was filled with parents, teachers, and government officials. Banners stretched across the hall, celebrating Nigeria's brightest minds. Rows of contestants sat at desks with papers and pencils, nerves etched into their young faces. Richard sat in the audience, his agbada crisp, but his hands clenched tightly in his lap. Emily sat beside him, whispering prayers under her breath. David's mother, dressed in her simple ankara, held a handkerchief and wiped her eyes repeatedly. She still couldn't believe her son was here, competing with children from the wealthiest families in Nigeria. The competition began. Complex problems flashed on the screen. Contestants scribbled furiously, pencils flying across papers. David bent over his sheet, his face calm, his mind sharp. Years of studying under streetlights, piecing knowledge together from torn pages, had prepared him for this moment more than anyone knew. As the rounds continued, students dropped out one by one. Some cried quietly, others bowed their heads in defeat. But David remained, his answers flowing with a quiet confidence. The audience murmured louder with each round he survived. "That's the boy," one whispered. "The trash boy," another added. But this time, the words carried awe, not scorn. Finally, the last question was announced. It was brutal, a puzzle even some university students would struggle with. David paused, staring at the paper. For a moment, doubt flickered in his eyes. Then, almost instinctively, he remembered the stones and bottle caps he once used on dusty ground. He visualized them in his mind, rearranging numbers like he had done for Emily months ago. Slowly, a smile spread across his face. His pencil moved quickly, and within minutes, the solution was complete. The bell rang. Papers were collected. Silence filled the hall as judges tallied the results. When the chief judge finally stepped up to the microphone, the air was electric. "Ladies and gentlemen, the winner of this year's National Mathematics Olympiad is..." He paused for effect. "David Emmanuel Williams." The hall erupted. Applause thundered. Emily jumped up, clapping wildly. David's mother fell to her knees, sobbing with joy. Richard rose to his feet, his eyes wet, his pride overflowing. David stood on the stage, medal around his neck, the spotlight blinding him. But inside he felt no fear. He had stepped from the trash heaps into the light of recognition, and he had earned it. Richard joined him on stage, placing a hand on his shoulder. "Now they will see," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Not the trash boy, but the genius."